One of the main things I want to look on at this video is to ask this question of why is Descartes important? And I would say that Descartes is important largely because people, and I think mistakenly, think that he gave us a great way of thinking about the world. And before Descartes, the way that people understood things was they had this method that they would call faith-seeking understanding, and that is that you believed things that maybe the church told you or maybe your family told you, and you believed those things, and then you tried to understand what it was that you were believing. One of the a couple things that led to Descartes to have this sort of change in thinking about how we think, first of all, would be the Reformation, because before the Reformation, for most people who lived in Europe, there was one way of believing, that was Catholic, and you just believed it because that's what everybody believed. But when the Protestant Reformation comes in, all of a sudden now we have a couple different options on what we believe. So how do we know which belief to choose? The second major influence is what we've come to know as a scientific revolution, especially in the 17th century. And when you look at someone like Galileo, he believed something. He thought that rather than the sun rotating around the earth actually rotated around the sun, a totally different way of thinking. And Galileo got in trouble for publishing or making that view public. And the Catholic Church quieted him down. They put it under house arrest because they thought that he was advocating things that the church said were wrong. And this idea of dogma became prominent, and that is, these are beliefs that you must believe. Even if you don't really believe them, you have to pretend that you believe them. And so this idea of dogma and these things that we are forced to believe leads Descartes into sort of changing a model of how we think. And so we're going to call this Descartes' doubting device. And what we bring into the thinking process would be just facts or evidence or things that we cannot have doubt about. So Descartes wants to exclude from that things like authority, because those are things that you're forced to believe, that you haven't come to on your own conclusion. And the other would be sense data, and that is that we can't really trust our senses all the time. And the process, once you get these things in there, the facts or evidence, is that you go through what has been called radical methodological doubt. And this is the idea that I will doubt anything. So for example, if I think that there's a table in front of me, I start doubting that. So yes, I see a table, but sometimes my senses can be wrong. And so I'm going to doubt that it's really there. And then when you end up through all of this doubting process, you end up with what Descartes would say are certain beliefs, things that you can be absolutely certain of. And so his method comes through a couple ways. One is that, remember, he's doubting stuff. And so if he wants to say that something exists, one of the doubting processes is to say, well, maybe I'm just dreaming it, because sometimes dreams feel really true. Or he also says, well, maybe I think that I see that thing, but there's an evil demon making me think I believe this. Or in a modern way, we might say that maybe we are brains in vats, and maybe a scientist is making us think that we see those things. So he ends up with this idea of, well, I am doubting everything, but the only thing I can't really doubt is that I am in fact doubting. And so the bottom line is he's saying that my experience of doubting things and coming to some sort of understanding is greater than or better than somebody else's experience. So I'm not going to trust what they say. I'm only going to trust what my mind has led me towards. And so the bottom line here is that, I guess the second bottom line would be that whereas it used to be that believing led to understanding, that is, I believed something and then I try to understand what it was I was believing, Descartes switches this to understanding leading to believing. So now it's not that I believe stuff and try to understand it, but I will only start with things that I'm absolutely certain of, and then I will go on to try and believe it. So what are some evaluations of Descartes' doubting device? Well, I would suggest that there are two main problems with this. And so even when people claim to be following the rational ideas and only believing things that are absolutely true, The first thing that I would say is that there's a problem of authority. We looked at this before. Of one example would be something like Richard Dawkins' letter to his daughter. And so he sends this letter to his 10-year-old daughter saying that as you go through life and you try to understand certain things, he says, if somebody tells you something and they are asking you to believe that based on their authority, you need to really, question that. You need to probably not accept anything that is given to you based on somebody's authority. And of course, the problem with this is that Dawkins himself is an authority. And so if his daughter is consistently following his advice, she has to reject his advice. Another example is something like E equals MC squared, or really any sort of scientific idea that we haven't come up with ourselves. We probably believe E equals MC squared, even though we don't really understand it. And there are all sort of mathematical ideas and scientific ideas that we accept as true that other people have found. But again, if we're being consistent with Descartes' method, we would have to reject all of those until we came up with them on our own. Another idea is the flat earth movement. And these guys are really very consistent with Descartes' method because they're saying we're rejecting anything based on authority and I'm only going to believe stuff that I can see myself. And, the earth looks flat. And the way I see it, it probably is. And so I'm not going to change my view until I can go up into space and see it for myself. Another is the idea of climate change. And again, scientists are kind of freaked out that only a small percentage of people believe in climate change. But again, if they're being consistent with Descartes' method, the only people who should actually believe in climate change are the ones who have the degrees to actually see it themselves. So I shouldn't really believe, if I'm being consistent with Descartes, I shouldn't really believe in climate change until I've received a PhD or earned a PhD and have done all the tests myself. And then I can finally accept it because I've looked at it all myself. So the bottom line is that, in fact, we believe and we accept authorities all the time. And the question is, which authority are you believing? And so, of course, what a lot of naturalists would say is that we should reject religious authority, but accept scientific authority. But really, you're accepting some authority. The question actually is one step further, is why do you accept one and not the other? As C.S. Lewis said, don't be scared of the word authority. Believing things on authority only means believing them because you've been told them by someone you think trustworthy. 99% of the things you believe are believed on authority. And so, in fact, this idea of basing things on authority, we do it all the time. So the first problem with Descartes' doubting device is that we can't reject authority. We have to bring that into our thinking process. The second problem with Descartes' doubting device would be what we would call the problem of rationalism and empiricism. So in other words, if Descartes is right and our thinking, our understanding is the first process of knowing things, well, we need to go back to how do we, at a very fundamental level, how do we know things? And in fact, there are two good candidates for how we know things. The first would be what would be called rationalism. And Descartes was a rationalist. And bottom line for rationalism is that you can't trust your senses. Remember Descartes, he said our senses can be lying to us, so we only need to believe things that we can intuitively know. For example, a rationalist would say that we know 2 + 2 is 4 because by the definition of 2 and by the definition of addition and by the definition of a 4, we can just intuit that in our brains by definition. And so we don't have to do any experiments, we just know it. So, and I'm also going to introduce a couple vocabulary terms here that are really going to become important when we look at Immanuel Kant in a little while. The first vocabulary idea is what philosophers use. It's a Latin phrase called a priori, and you can probably figure out what this means because prior, something before. And so a priori knowledge is something that you know before experiencing it. So I know things before I experience it. So I know 2 + 2 is 4 without ever doing an experiment on it. The other idea, the other vocabulary idea here would be analytical statements. And these are statements that are true by definition. So, for example, a cat is an animal. That is true regardless of where you live, when you live, anything, that a cat is an animal. By definition, that is true. And it will always be true, and it always has been true. And that is what a cat means. It's part of the animal. It's not a plant. It's not a rock or something. Okay, so this first way of knowing would be what the rationalists say, and that is that we know things intuitively in our brains. The second possibility of how we know things would be empiricism. For example, John Locke or David Hume are empiricists. And what they say is that you can only trust your senses. You only know things because you've experienced them. For example, John Locke, you maybe have heard of this, is that he says the mind is a blank slate. That is that it's just, there's nothing, when you're born, it's just empty. And as you start experiencing things, then there's stuff written on this slate. And then okay, that's a tree because someone told me it's a tree, and you just start adding that experience. For example, an empiricist would say that 2 + 2 is 4 because you've done some sort of experiment. You have 2 apples, and you add 2 more apples, and then you count them up, and okay, there's 4 there. And so I know 2 + 2 is 4 because I've experienced it. So a couple vocabulary ideas here is that this sort of knowledge is what philosophers would call a posteriori. And this is that I know things after experiencing it. So it comes prior to experience. And they would use what we would call synthetic statements. And so a synthetic statements are things that we know through observation. So for example, a synthetic statement might be the cat is on the mat. Is that true? Well, I look over, I see the cat is on the mat. And since I've seen that, I can now say that this is true. Okay, so it's different from an analytical statement, which would be a cat is an animal, which is always true. This is a synthetic statement, which is I look at it and I realize, okay, this is where the cat is at this minute. Okay, so what does this all mean? So the problem of rationalism and empiricism, remember, if Descartes' right, actually all understanding falls into one of these two categories. And the problem with rationalism is that ultimately a priori analytical statements are ultimately knowable, but they're not really meaningful. For example, that idea that a cat is an animal, that's an a priori analytical statement. Yeah, it's true, but it doesn't tell me anything. Like if you say something about your cat and I say, okay, a cat is an animal, I don't know what color the cat is. I don't know where the cat is. Is it on the mat? Is it outside on the porch? I can never know those sort of meaningful things based on just sort of rationalist ideas. The problem with the other side, the empiricist, so a priori or a posteriori synthetic statements, they're meaningful. And so by observation, I can look and I can see where the cat is. So that's meaningful because it actually does tell me things in real life that could be helpful. If I'm looking for the cat, I would want a posteriori synthetic statement to help me with that. So where's the cat? Someone says, oh, the cat is over there because I see it over there. That will help me. But somebody if I say, where's the cat? And they say, well, a cat is an animal. Okay, what? Okay, but that doesn't help me at all because that doesn't tell me where the cat is. Okay, so it's meaningful, but it's not ultimately knowable because yes, I might know where the cat is now, but I don't know where it's going to be tomorrow. I don't know where it's going to be next week. And so I have to always be updating my knowledge if I'm going to be an empiricist. Okay, so here's what this means. So if Descartes is right, and we're using I think, therefore I am, that understanding comes before believing, how do I understand stuff? Well, is it an empiricist model? Well, that's going to be meaningful. But ultimately, since I'm basing everything on experiences and experiences change, I'm never going to really know everything I want to know. Whereas if I'm looking at a rationalist model, okay, yes, it's knowable, like a cat is an animal, I can do those kind of things, but it's not going to be meaningful because I'm not updating things based on experiences in real time. So here's a summary of where we're going with this. Okay, so based on what we looked at, the idea that actually we have to bring authority into our system, which Descartes wants to leave out. it's just not doable. We are always looking at some sort of authority. Or if we're saying, okay, we're going to start with understanding, well, which model are you going to take? Empiricist, there's a problem with that. Are you going to be a rationalist? There's a problem with that as well. And so what we see is really Descartes' methodology of understanding before believing is inherently flawed. And so which is better, believing leading to understanding or understanding leading to believing? So the conclusion is that if we are trying to do understanding before believing, there are some really major problems with that system. And we will actually look soon at Immanuel Kant, who's going to try to solve those problems. So stay tuned for that in the future.